Hey everyone, if you like the channel, please consider subscribing. It means a ton. Thanks so much. Enjoy the video.
This plant right next to me that I'm very carefully not touching is one species of stinging nettle. There are multiple different species of this. Two of the most common are wood nettle and stinging nettle. So Laportia canadensis and Urtica dioica. And all of the stinging nettle species have stinging hairs. It's not actually the hairs that sting you, but the hairs have little tiny barbs on them that get under your skin and inject formic acid, which is actually in bee stings and ant bites. So that's why it stings. And that means we need to be super careful when we're harvesting it so we don't get stung. It actually can be good for things like arthritis, but can also be pretty painful. So I try and avoid it whenever I can. So I wear gloves, and simple garden gloves will do the trick. You could wear leather gloves as well, whatever works for you. Generally, I will just take my pruners and cut down near the bottom of this plant. You can do it one of two ways, actually. You could just cut the top as if you were cutting the top of basil or another garden herb, and maybe cut just this top part, and you always want to cut close to this joint where one of the leaves is coming off the stem. Or you could cut down closer to the bottom, just above the last 2 to 4 leaves, and that will help this plant regrow. So this is a very nutritious green. So like other dark leafy greens, it's going to have a lot of vitamins and minerals in it. So it's a great one to harvest and dry, and we'll talk about the spices that we can make with it later. Right now, I'm standing in the middle of one of my favorite wild spices. This is Bee Balm. The species is Monarda didyma, and as you can see right now, it's at the end of its life cycle, and it's growing on a farm. So you can cultivate wild spices as well, and then they'll be near your house, and you can harvest them anytime that you want. In the growing season, this has a gorgeous red flower that the hummingbirds love. Another name for this, which I like to call it, is wild oregano, because I make wild oregano salt. And the reason why it's called wild oregano is because it tastes like oregano, but honestly, I think it tastes even better. There's another very closely related species, Monarda fistulosa, which I call wild bergamot, but some people interchange those two names. They taste pretty similarly, but just slightly different. So try them both and see which you like better. Another name for this plant is Oswego tea, because it's a very popular tea with the Oswego Native American tribe. It also was substituted for black tea back in the day when the tea trade was very difficult. So it makes a great tea as well. And this is in the mint family, so I'll harvest it just like other mints. And like other plants in the mint family, it has a square stem. So all mints have square stems, but not all square stems are mints. So make sure you always have 100% positive identification. The stem is very angular, looks very square, and these leaves are directly opposite each other. So that helps us to identify it, along with just smelling the leaf. So if I harvest one of these leaves and I crush it up, it smells so good and really similar to oregano, but actually even stronger. So I love harvesting this one. There is something that will happen to this plant though, especially later in the season, where it will get what is called downy mildew on it. So the leaves sometimes will appear covered with this kind of like white film or white blotches, and that's downy mildew. And then we wouldn't want to harvest that. And that happens if it's growing in a really wet place, which sometimes it does like to grow in wet places, or it's growing really close together like this, and there's not enough air circulation. So make sure you look at those leaves before you harvest them and look for that downy mildew. You can harvest a lot of it. The way that I'll harvest it is just like I harvest basil, which is in the mint family, and I'll either harvest this top and just cut off the top leaves, or harvest it further down, leaving a couple pairs of leaves on the bottom. And both of those ways of harvesting will stimulate regrowth. Bee Balm, amazing spice. I'm standing here with a white pine, and this is the most common pine in the eastern US. How do I know that this is a white pine? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off some of these clusters of needles. So here we go. Here's a cluster. This is actually called a fascicle. And I'm going to count the number of needles in this fascicle. So there's 5. And the way that I remember this is that the word white has 5 letters in it and 5 needles in this cluster. So sometimes it's possible that weird things happen and that this cluster might lose a needle or 2. So what I like to say is to take the average. So look at the needles, look at several different clusters and count the needles in each one to make sure that the majority of them have 5 needles so that you know which pine you're looking at. Lots of times it doesn't matter too much because at least here in the eastern US, there are no poisonous pines. But you always want to research where you are to make sure that you have 100% positive ID. I'm just going to keep saying it before we ingest anything. So there are lots of edible pines, and the pines aren't something that I would just like take a big bite of and eat, but they're a great spice along with firs and spruces and hemlock trees. That's the tree, not the poison hemlock. So again, 100% positive identification. The great thing about evergreens is that you can harvest them all year long. So they're one of the few plants that we can harvest throughout the winter. And they have a ton of vitamin C in them as well. So we'll talk about these later when we're making our spices, but there's a couple of different ways that you can harvest pine, and you could just harvest each fascicle individually, but if you're gonna get a fair amount, there's an easier way to do this. And we always wanna harvest ethically and sustainably, so we don't wanna take a large percentage of the needles on the tree, but maybe 10% or less would be okay. But if we have a lot of trees, we can just take a little bit from each one, and that's super helpful for us and the environment and the tree. So what I would do if I wanted a lot of needles would be to take my pruners and just cut like right here. And you notice there's some yellow needles on this tree. And so those are dying. So I don't want to harvest those. We just want to harvest the best looking parts of the plant. So I'd take my pruners and I'd clip it right here. And then I could just take this home and strip these needles off, and it would be really easy. I never dry pine because the needles tend to get brown and lose a lot of their vitality. And because it's available all year long, I never need to do that. So that's a really great thing about pine and evergreens in general. So again, I'll just cut it right here, take it home, strip those needles off, then put them into my salt or vinegar or whatever I'm gonna do with this. This tree is a hemlock, and it's a kind of evergreen in the pine family. And there are a couple of different kinds. This one is in the genus Tsuga, Tsuga, and I do like to harvest it for spices. Sometimes I'll mix it with other evergreen needles. However, I am a little hesitant to talk about it because it is a threatened tree, because it gets attacked by this insect called the woolly adelgid. So I will only harvest from this tree if it looks really good, and there are a lot of needles that look well and healthy. And if you see little tiny white things on the needles or the ends of the branches, that is the evidence of the woolly adelgid. So if you are going to harvest this, please just take a little bit to keep it sustainable. And do make sure that you have proper identification, because it could possibly be confused with a yew tree, not like you, but like YEW. And we don't usually see those in the wild, but it might be possible that it would spread somewhere. So again, just make sure that you have the right tree.